Which one's it going to be? 254. 254. When the trumpet of the Lord shall sound, and time shall be no more, and the morning breaks eternal, bright and fair. When the saints of earth shall gather over on the other shore, and the roll is called up yonder, I'll be there. When the roll is called up yonder, 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 I'll be there. Let us labor for the Master from the dawn till setting sun. Let us talk of all His wondrous love and care. Then when all of life is over and our work on earth is done, and the roll is called up yonder, I'll be there. When the roll is called up yonder, 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 I'll be there. Go on, Carter, man. Land's ready to go. What we got? 109. First and third. I have decided to follow Jesus. I have decided to follow Jesus. I have decided to follow Jesus. No turning back, no turning back. My cross I'll carry till I see Jesus. My cross I'll carry till I see Jesus. My cross I'll carry till I see Jesus. No turning back, I'll follow Him. Everybody. Bill, you gonna land? All right. Get your notebooks out. We're going to continue our study of matters pertaining to the doctrine of Calvinism. We began with a look at the matter of faith only. And I want us to do some things now. We introduced 2 Sundays ago, or I guess 3 Sundays ago, introduced the matter of total depravity. And we made mention that this is the total depravity or total inability of man to please God in any way it's the foundation. If that doctrine is true, then all of Calvinism is necessarily true. If it is false, then the rest of Calvinism is also false. In other words, this is the foundation of it. And if it's true, then it's all, again, by necessity has to be true. But if it's false, the rest of it also follows to be false. And so I want us to think a little bit about the matter of depravity and the idea that man from the time of his conception is sinful and totally unable in any way not only to please God, but to respond to the call of God. without the direct intervention of God. In other words, God has to do it for him. There is no such thing as free will in the doctrine of Calvinism. Now they can finagle their way around, and they can talk about this or that, and that they believe in free will, this or that, but they don't. There's no way to believe in free will if you believe in the doctrine of Calvinism. And people say, no, you just don't understand it. So no, I do understand it. and there's no way to reconcile human free will with the doctrine of total depravity. Now, one thing that I did that's not going to be in your notebook that I wanted to kind of throw out to you is I had made a note originally when we studied this about 3 years ago, maybe 4 now, looking at a website by a denominational preacher and hardcore ardent Calvinist by the name of John Piper. And he has a website called Desiring God. And I had made a note about that website down here, and I don't think I ever got to the matter of the website. And so I went to the website, and Piper has what I assume is a 5-part video series, but the transcripts are also available on what's called the Tulip Introduction. Now, Calvinism can be summarized in 5 doctrines that, beginning with the first letter of each one, spells the word tulip. The idea of total depravity. That's what we're studying this morning, or this evening. Unconditional election, that God chooses every person before the foundation of the world who's going to be saved and who's going to be lost, and there's nothing you can do about it. The idea of limited atonement, that Jesus did not die for everyone, but only those that God foreordained and predestined. The irresistible grace, that if God chooses to save you, when he decides to save you, there's nothing you can do about it. It is God's grace, and it is irresistible. It is exactly as the doctrine says. And then the doctrine of the perseverance of the saints, which we also understand, know as once saved, always saved, or the impossibility of apostasy. And so in the first lesson in this Tulip series by Piper, there were some notes, and he made mention. He said that human depravity is total in at least 5 ways. And I wrote down 4 of them because one of them could be true if he got his terminology right. In other words, the point that he makes could be right if you understood the doctrine of grace properly and the doctrine of faith properly, which no Calvinist does. And so it's one of those things where they could say something and we could understand it to be true, and they could understand it to be true, even though we're talking about 2 completely different things. In other words, their understanding of certain words and phrases is totally opposite of ours. And so I only wrote down 4 of these, and I thought I would share some of these. And what it is, there are 4 things he says that so-called prove that total depravity is true. And then there's some verses, all right? And so what I did was I just put these 4 things down, and I thought I would share these with you. And the reason is, I also want to show you that the verses that he provides do not teach what he says that they teach. In other words, in many cases, the verses that he provides actually teach the opposite of what he's teaching. For example, he says, depravity affects every human. In other words, every single person is totally depraved, totally unable. And then, but here's the first verse that he provides. Romans 3:23. For all have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. But that's not the doctrine of total depravity. The doctrine of total depravity is not that all men have sinned. The doctrine of total depravity is that from the time you were conceived in your mother's womb, you were a sinner. And so Romans 3:23 does not teach total depravity in the sense in which Calvinists teach it. It teaches that all of us sin. But also, I want to note this. Well, I don't want to get far ahead of myself. I want to come back to this point. All right. So there's the first verse. All right. Here's 1 Kings 8:46. There is no man who does not sin. Okay. Does that teach total depravity?
No.
No, it just teaches that, again, it just teaches that all of us sin at some point in our lives. 1 John 1 and verse 8. If we say we have no sin, we are deceiving ourselves, and the truth is not in us. Does that teach total depravity? No. None of those passages teach total depravity. They all do teach that we as human beings do sin. But they do not teach total depravity. Now, what Piper would say in response to that is, it proves that we are depraved because we do sin. Because we all do sin, there's the proof that we're all totally depraved. All right, now, let me ask you a question. I'm going to ask, according to Calvinism, who are the only two people that were never born totally depraved? Adam. Well, the word "born" is not the right word. That's not the right word. But you're on the right track. Adam and Eve would be the only people that did not inherit sin from their parents. Okay? Adam and Eve did not inherit sin from their parents because God created them. But according to Calvinism, everybody after that has inherited the sin of Adam and a fallen nature. And so Piper would say, because everybody does sin, that proves that they're totally depraved. All right? Now, let's look at all the people who ever lived who were not totally depraved according to Calvinism. Adam and Eve. How many of them sinned? All of them. You see how foolish this idea is? That the idea that just because we sin, because all men sin, it shows that they're totally depraved. And yet, the only two people that God ever made and did not inherit any type of sin according to God, they all sinned. They all sinned. And so, just by the virtue of the facts of the matter, the idea that all men sin cannot point to total depravity because neither Adam or Eve could have inherited any sin, and they both sinned. And they both sinned. And so we all ended up in the same boat. And so this idea of total depravity, or that we all sin because we're totally depraved, falls flat on its face because Adam and Eve both sinned. In other words, everybody that ever lived that didn't inherit sin, a sinful nature, they also sinned. We all ended up in the same boat. All right? And so, and they would say, well, Adam and Eve had free will and they sinned. But we cannot have free will because we inherited a sinful nature. Wait a minute. So you're saying the people that inherit the sinful nature end up in the same boat as the people who have free will? See how foolish that is. And so we can still have free will just like Adam and Eve did. And you know what's going to happen? We're going to end up in the same boat as Adam and Eve. We have free will in the exact same sense that Adam and Eve had free will. But we do sin because we choose to sin. We exercise our free will. And so I wanted to point that out. All right, now here's the one that I heard this on a tape 25 years ago. G.K. Wallace lecturing on the subject of Calvinism at the Freed-Hardeman Lectures in 1972 or 4. I've got the cassettes of that lecture, and I had never heard this before, but Wallace knew what he was talking about. And he said, the Calvinist believes that before God saves him, everything he does is a sin. If he pays his debts, it's a sin. If he loves his wife, it's a sin. If he loves his children, it's a sin. Everything he does is a sin. Now, even Calvinists can't agree on this. Even Calvinists cannot agree on this. They'll say, well, no, some people can live morally upright lives in regard to loving their wives or their children or serving others. But so far as being pleasing to God, they can never do anything to please God. Well, Piper at least is honest in his assessment. He says, in his total rebellion, by the way, this is a direct quote from his page, okay? In his total rebellion, everything man does is sin. In his total rebellion, everything man does is sin. So, if you love your wife, it's a sin. If you pay all your bills on time, it's a sin. You serve your country, you serve your community or your country as a firefighter or a policeman. You save somebody's life. Guess what? Sin. It's a sin. Everything man does is a sin. Now think about that. Doing things that God tells us to do is still a sin because we haven't got rid of our sinful nature yet. Now here's the verses that he provides. 2 of them. Whatever is not of faith is sin. Whatever is not of faith is sin. That's Romans 14:23. Which Romans 14 is simply talking about matters of conscience. It's talking about matters that are neither sinful that are not sinful in and of themselves, but could be sinful if we don't practice them with a clear conscience. For example, eating meat or eating only, being a vegetarian. And Paul spoke later in 1 Corinthians 8 about eating meat offered to idols, different things. And so this verse is not even anywhere in the ballpark of teaching what he says it teaches. And then you have Hebrews 11:6. Without faith, it's impossible to please God. Without faith, but it says, for he who comes to God must believe that he is, and that he is a rewarder of those who seek him. Those who do what? Seek him. But Calvinism says you can't seek God. Because you have total inability. You can't seek God. And yet the verse he quotes says that a man has to seek God in order to please God. So you see the foolishness. You see the foolishness of this. Then I'll just skip down here to the last one. Our rebellion is totally deserving of eternal punishment. Piper says our rebellion against God deserves eternal punishment. Now, how is it that a person can rebel against God if, number one, they have no free will, and 2, God has already determined that they're going to be lost? How do you rebel against God under those circumstances? You can't. It's not possible to rebel against God under those particular circumstances. And so this is just foolishness. But this is the heart of Calvinism. I mean, this is the heart of Calvinism. I'll keep this up here. If somebody wants it, they can have it or take a picture of it and look at it on their own. But I was also looking at some things that pertain. Now, this is something that I've learned to do quite a bit, and it took me a long time to do this in my study. But I found it to be very, very helpful. And that is to go back, and by the way, understand, only the Bible is inspired literature, okay? Only the Bible is inspired. But we can learn a lot from the writings of those men who lived with the apostles up through about the next 250 years. They're called the Ante-Nicene Fathers. A-N-T-E, not anti, A-N-T-I, but A-N-T-E, meaning before the Council of Nicaea, which was in about 320, I think it's in either 313, 323, somewhere in there that year, somewhere in the early 300s. So you have the writings of uninspired men over the course of about we'll just say 200 years. In other words, the men that lived closest to the apostles, the men who saw some of the original documents that were written in the New Testament. And they wrote. These men were prolific writers. And they wrote about almost every subject under the sun, as far as the Bible is concerned. And you would expect you would expect that those men who lived closest to the time of the apostles would probably have a pretty good idea about what the apostles meant when they wrote certain things, right? In other words, you can use the writings of the Ante-Nicenes as a commentary of sorts. In other words, you find a subject and you say, well, what did the Ante-Nicenes, what did the early, well, sometimes they're called the early church fathers. Well, what did the early church fathers believe about this or this? Now, I first started doing this about 4 or 5, again, if I say it's 4 or 5 years ago, it's probably 6 or more. But I was asked to speak at the Memphis School of Preaching lectureship on the subject of restoring biblical grace. And so what I did in my preparation was I wrote down a body of work from the New Testament about the grace of God. And then I wrote down the current views of religious groups about the grace of God. Then I went and I studied the writings of the early church fathers and what they had to say about the grace of God. And guess who is not in agreement? Guess who is not in agreement with the New Testament or the early church fathers? That would be the people today. The people today are not in agreement with the New Testament or the early church fathers. Now that ought to tell us something, right? That ought to tell us something. And so I was doing some research and I found a little website, and I don't know that I didn't even write the website down, but I found an article called 3 Arguments Against Total Depravity. And it's interesting because this guy did exactly the same thing that I would have done. In other words, obviously I'm going to start with the Bible, right? I'm going to go to the Bible. But if I were going to show that what I believe about the Bible is right, I'd want some confirmation from the guys that lived closest to the writing of the Bible. And so the writing of the Ante-Nicenes is very helpful. Now, here's what this guy says about total depravity. He says, the doctrine of total depravity developed about 500 years ago. Well, John Calvin lived about 500 years ago. None of the church fathers believed it. In other words, you can research the writings of other church fathers, and you can't find any of them that believe in total depravity. They all strongly affirmed that a man has the power to choose good or evil. In other words, that's the unanimous consent of all the early church fathers. Not that we were born sinners. Not that we didn't have a choice in being saved. But rather that we were all created with free will, and we all make our own choices to obey God or disobey God. All right? Now here's Justin Martyr, one of the earliest and most well-known early church fathers. Lived up from about the year 100. I mean, born about the time the New Testament was stopped writing, and lived the next 65 years. Now here's what he writes. Let us suppose, or let some suppose from what has been said, that we say that whatever occurs happens by fatal necessity, because it was foretold as known beforehand. A fatal necessity means fate. You know what fate is? It means it's going to happen no matter what. That's the classic idea of fate. That something is going to... All right, fate is Wile E. Coyote getting run over on the railroad tracks. That's fate. Right? He's chasing the roadrunner. The roadrunner runs across the railroad tracks. Now the coyote, he's been around a time or two, right? He's took a few licks at the hand of the roadrunner. So the coyote, he runs up, and rather than crossing the tracks, he comes to a screeching halt. You know, digs them heels in. So what does he do? He looks down the tracks this way just as far as he can, out there in the middle of the desert, and you can see for miles, right? No train coming. He looks down this way down the tracks, can see for miles, no train coming. Decides to cross the tracks, and the minute he gets in the middle of them, what happens? Wham! Going to get run over by a train. That is fate. And by the way, and watching that cartoon, we all knew what was going to happen to Cody, right? We all knew that when he looked both directions and there was no trains for 100 miles, the minute he crossed the tracks, he's going to get slammed by a train. Fate. That's Calvinism. That's Calvinism. That no matter what you think appears to be real or true or possible, none of it. None of it. It's going to happen no matter what. So when Justin Martyr talks about a fatal necessity, he doesn't mean like fatal, like a fatal wound. He means fatal in the sense of fate, that it has to happen. He said, there are some people who say that everything that happens is out of a fatal necessity because God has already decreed it. But he says, but we have learned from the prophets, and we hold it to be true, that punishments, chastisements, and good rewards are rendered according to the merit of each man's actions. Justin Martyr said, no matter what happens to us is the result of our own choices. Now, and then he follows up with this. If this is not so, but all things happen by fate, then neither is anything at all in our own power. Now that's the writing of Justin Martyr against the idea of total depravity. It's not fate. It's not predestined to happen. Everything that happens because of the choices that we make, and we are not predestined to life or death apart from our own actions. Here's Tatian. Tatian from about the year 120 to 180. He says, we were not created to die. Rather, we die by our own fault. Our free will has destroyed us. We who were free have become slaves. We have been sold through sin. Nothing evil has been created by God. But Calvinism said everything evil has been created by God. Because God creates everything and He determines everything. That means even sin is created by God and sin is ordained by God. Tatian says not so. Here's a Melito, 2nd century. There is nothing, therefore, to hinder you from changing your evil manner of life, because you are a free man. He lived, again, 2nd century. That would be in the 100s. Irenaeus, in the middle to late 100s, early 200s, says, man has been made free in his will, with power over himself, and is himself his own cause, that sometimes he becomes wheat and sometimes chaff. Whether he be wheat that is gathered and held by the master, or whether he be chaff which is shaken out and winnowed away with his winnowing fan, all resides within himself. And there are other things that we could mention. But again, this is the argument against total depravity. That all of the men who lived basically current with or immediately following the days of the apostles, none of them believed that. None of them ever taught it. And in fact, there's some research that shows that the Gnostics actually did teach this idea of fatalism. And Gnostics were always regarded as heretics. They were regarded as heretics. All right. Now there's one more thing, and I've never thought about this. I never thought about this. And that is that the humanity of Jesus disproves total depravity. The humanity of Jesus disproves total depravity. Now, the Calvinist is going to say, well, Jesus was not born of a man, but was just born of a woman. But the problem is, that woman would have to be totally depraved, right? Mary would have to be totally depraved. And so, to me, that doesn't solve any problem. Because if he's born of a woman, he's still a human being. And if he's a human being, then he has to be made in every way like as we are. Now, think about this. The Bible says that Jesus was made in every way like unto his brethren. Jesus was made in every way like unto his brethren. Who are his brethren? Humans. That's the concept of humanity. Well, if the Bible says Jesus was made in every way like unto every other human, then what? Well, then Jesus has to be totally depraved. I mean, to me, that's a pretty simple argument. Now, it may be overly simplistic. Maybe it is. But I had never considered it. All right, here's the passage, Hebrews 2:17. Jesus was made like his brothers in every respect. Hebrews 2:17. Hebrews 4 and verse 15.
Hey, Todd,
Sir.
Wasn't he made that way so he could prove that we could be saved?
That's exactly right, Walter. That is exactly right. Jesus was made just like us in order to show us that perfect living is possible. That Jesus lived perfectly. He lived perfectly. As an example for us that we can live perfectly. And Walter, I would even go back to the verse that we looked at this morning from 1 Corinthians 10:13. If we're tempted to sin and God provides a way of escape, we can't take it. If I'm totally depraved, I can't even take God's way of escape. Well, why would God provide me a way of escape if I can't take it? You see how that fails on so many levels, this idea that we're totally depraved? The Bible says, let no man say when he is tempted, I'm tempted of God. For God cannot be tempted with sin, neither does he tempt any man. But each one of us sins when we are drawn away by our own lust and enticed. And lust, when it is conceived, brings forth sin. And sin, when it is finished, brings forth death. James 1, verses 13 through 16. You can also look at 1 John chapter 3 and verse 4. That tells us that sin is a transgression of the law. In other words, sin is something that we do. It's something that we commit because we pursue our own desires and fail to pursue God's way of escape. And so those are just a few things that I wanted us to think about tonight. Lord willing, in our next time around, Philip, did anything come in? Okay, nothing came in on the... Okay. I want us to look at some of the so-called proof texts of total depravity. These should be in your notebook. They would be Romans 5 and verse 12, Ephesians 2, verses 1 to 3, Psalm 51 and verse 5, and Romans 6, verses 12 through 17. And we'll look at those, Lord willing, in our next session. So just want to be mindful of that. We'll come back to those. So are there any questions about... Look, I realize some of this can be confusing because we're not Calvinists. And that it's not something that we think about a lot, but this dominates the thinking of literally tens, perhaps even hundreds of millions of people around the world. This idea of total depravity, and there are varying issues that are associated with it. But I want you to bear with me because the nature of God and the nature of man is the very essence of understanding the Bible properly. If we miss that, we miss the whole thing. And so like I said, bear with me, and we'll keep plugging along. And I appreciate I appreciate your good attention and your patience with me on this. Get this turned off right here. All right.